Happy Sunday, everyone. Today we are talking about a topic that may result in the YouTube version of this video getting banned. We will see. That is the topic of vaccines, particularly as promoted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and looking at what the promotion of vaccines has looked like by leaders of the church. Now, a few qualifiers, perhaps, as we get started. The first is that I am not an anti-vaxxer. I probably am perceived by anyone who's heard me talk about vaccines in that way, but I'm not at all inherently anti-vaccine. I am pro-informed choice and pro-consent, and I think that most people are not, including physicians, as we'll get into, are not really informed about vaccines in any substantive depth, but I'm not inherently anti-vaccines, and I'll make that point firmly more later. I am, however, when it comes to infants and toddlers and so forth, I am pro increasing the delay, significantly delaying vaccines rather than loading these kids up. There's been, as this graphic shows, a massive increase in recommended vaccines for infants, for newborns in their first months of life compared to when I was born, for example, in 1981. The reality, of course, being that people like me and others, we're not getting all the boosters that are recommended. You don't see calamitous, pandemic level breakouts because we don't have herd immunity for all these things that we were once vaccinated for which we were told, you're going to have to get all these boosters. Like, no one gets boosters. And yet they're, telling us inject your kids with all these things in their first 12 months of life. So I favor, for those who are going to vaccinate with their kids with all these different things, a significantly delayed vaccination schedule. This one shows you, for example, from the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics, from birth through 6 years of life, how many vaccines are being recommended and how often. Take special note there of COVID-19 and influenza vaccine at 6 months. That is insane. We'll get into some of this. I should note also as a qualifier, anti-immunity for vaccine manufacturers. I think that is reprehensible and ridiculous that Congress back in the 80s passed laws granting immunity to these vaccine manufacturers so that they can't be sued, they can't be held accountable. I am very pro-capitalism. I am pro companies making medicines and products that can help people, but I'm very anti-crony capitalism with an incestuous revolving door between, for example, Pfizer and the CDC and the media, right? That is not the capitalism that I support, where you have Pfizer and other companies like it funding propaganda and buying off the people who might otherwise be skeptical of them and oversee and regulate their activities, despite having immunity. All right, let's take this then away from the qualifiers into the church stuff. The start of this musing, we're talking about a press release that came out March of 2021 from the First President. This is a church press release about a handbook update. The First Presidency statement that we'll talk about momentarily, that we all know from COVID urging us to get vaccinated, that came in August of 2021. So this comes a few months prior. It's an update to the handbook. And the press release says, a new entry on vaccinations reemphasizes direction the First Presidency has consistently given since at least 1978. Vaccinations administered by competent medical professionals protect health and preserve life. Members of the church are encouraged to safeguard themselves, their children, and their communities through vaccination. Ultimately, individuals are responsible to make their own decisions about vaccination. If members have concerns, they should counsel with competent medical professionals and also seek the guidance of the Holy Ghost. Prospective missionaries who have not been vaccinated will likely be limited to assignments in their home country. So, a few things that stand out there to me. Vaccinations administered by competent medical professionals. Doctors often don't know diddly squat about testing or side effects. They just know what the manufacturers are claiming, what the CDC has given their stamp of approval on, right? Especially for newer vaccines that have come out, something like a COVID vaccine. Doctors were, not at all clued in on any in-depth research, especially because Pfizer and others had suppressed any of the side effects and the detailed research that might be unflattering to the rollout of the vaccine. So competent medical professionals, when we're talking about competence, it's more than just being able to regurgitate propaganda from the CDC. I would expect from my physician a level of competence of actual study in depth of these things and not just parroting the propaganda that they were told. Now, it also says members of the church are encouraged to get vaccinated. In general, all of them, every vaccine that exists. So the church here in the handbook is not clear about, I think by implication, they're saying all vaccines that have been approved are good and you should do them, because there's no exceptions given. I also find it interesting here that it says you're encouraged to safeguard yourselves through vaccination. It doesn't say through other health measures, through reliance on God, through the priesthood. We'll get into some of that a little bit later. And, then it says members are responsible to make their own decisions, but they should counsel with, again, competent medical professionals. I don't think frontline doctors are often competent on these things in any depth. Okay, so in that statement, the very first sentence, it says that the First Presidency has consistently given this direction since at least 1978. That's kind of interesting. We'll get to 1978 in a moment, but it's perhaps misleading if you come away from that thinking that in 1978 is when the First Presidency started talking about it. The reference does say since at least 1978, though it's curious why they chose that year when there are a number of statements beforehand. Let's start with the year 1900. Smallpox, of course, had been a problem for decades prior to 1900, but in that year there was an outbreak in New York City that started to, ramp up the fear and hysteria. Now, in Utah alone, in 1899 and 1900, there were reported 4,000 cases of smallpox and a reported 26 deaths. There was a lot of controversy around a potential vaccine mandate because this would be in the greater good. This would achieve herd immunity, et cetera, et cetera. So in 1901, the Utah State Legislature passed a bill outlawing compulsory vaccination. Notwithstanding many people saying, hey, this is good, this can help, they didn't like that there were people saying that the government ought to mandate it. So the legislature says, nope, we are outlawing compulsory vaccination. The governor vetoed the bill, and then the legislature overrode the governor's veto and then passed the law ending, in this case, it was compulsory vaccination of school children. Of course, in the years, since then, there were many other Utahns who died of smallpox, but the concern at the time was the compulsory side. So in that year, 1900, Lorenzo Snow is president of the church, and together with his first counselor, George Cannon, they recommended that members seek out and obtain the smallpox vaccination. Here's the quote. To the question of vaccination, we've given careful thought and consideration. We are aware that there is a difference of opinion in the community as to the merits of this question, and we have felt reluctant to express ourselves publicly on it. Now, however, we feel to suggest and recommend that the people generally avail themselves of the opportunity to become vaccinated. That message was published in the Deseret Evening News, suggesting that people generally, as it says, avail themselves of the opportunity to become vaccinated. They then added, quote, we take this opportunity of suggesting to the saints that they employ every precaution to prevent the spread of this contagion. Okay, so 1900, here we have an example of the church president through the church's official newspaper, the Deseret Evening News, publishing a statement suggesting and recommending that everyone get vaccinated. Fast forward a few decades, we'll go to 1956. Now we're talking not about smallpox, but about polio. So in 1955, the polio vaccine had become available. And in 1956, as a result, the First Presidency issued a letter encouraging the vaccination of missionaries. So in the last paragraph, they wrote the following. In recent years, we've had a number of tragic cases of polio in the missions, and we are confident that missionaries and their parents will see the wisdom of taking every precaution to avoid tragedies of this kind. It was a very focused message on missionaries. However, just a few months later, January of 1957, the First Presidency said this. We are grateful that there is assurance and hope in the prospect of universal protective vaccination. We commend all our citizens, particularly the women, who are giving so generously of their time and effort in support of the campaign. We have no hesitancy in urging all members of the church and other citizens to support the campaign now in progress by giving as generously as each can afford and by making sure that all members of families, unless exempted on doctor's orders, receive Salk vaccine inoculation, which was the polio vaccine. Now, over the years, I have seen various people say, oh, these vaccines are not needed, they weren't helpful. For example, I've seen this image floating around, the red line showing when the polio vaccine was introduced in 1955, and that polio was already on the decline. You can see prior to that year, it's plummeting. And so the inference, the implication has been, when people have shared this online, that, oh, look, the vaccine wasn't actually needed. I think that's somewhat misleading. It's like when I see people attacking, I don't know, some financial, like a stock or Bitcoin or whatever, right? And they're like, oh, look at how it's going down. And then I say, well, if you zoom the chart out a little bit, you're going to see far better context for what's really happening. So too with polio cases. That graphic starts in 1937. Let's go all the way back to 1910, and you see a different result. That prior to that spike, there was consistently around 5 to 10-ish thousand polio cases in the United States, and then after the vaccine, it plummets to effectively zero. So I think it's indisputed that the polio vaccine did help eradicate the final remnants of polio. So the First Presidency here, right, saying we want everyone, unless exempted on doctor's orders, to receive the polio vaccine. Now let's go not to 1978 quite yet, but 2 years prior, 1976. Now we're talking about the swine flu. So in early 1976, a flu broke out at Fort Dix, New Jersey. One soldier died, a bunch of other soldiers got sick, and so there were some tests done on the influenza strain. It was H1N1, closely related to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which was devastating. So the CDC and people are freaking out. They're thinking, oh my gosh, this is potentially another global flu pandemic. So the federal government under President Ford, under advice from the CDC and their health officials, announced a nationwide plan to vaccinate every American against the swine flu. They funded it with $135 million, trying to administer the vaccine to 220 million Americans. It had a rushed rollout of this vaccine. It was rapidly developed and distributed with a focus on speed over extensive testing. Sound familiar? Probably should. But despite the hysteria, this H1N1 strain did not spread beyond Fort Dix. There was no significant outbreak in the broader population. Only one person died. But there was a mandatory vaccine campaign as a result of, in reaction to this outbreak. And as a result of that mandatory vaccination campaign, some 450 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome developed, which is a rare neurological disorder, often triggered by reaction to vaccines. There were also approximately 25 deaths related to the swine flu vaccine. So they halt the program because a bunch of people are dying from getting the vaccine. 9 months after it began, the national average for vaccination was about 20%. Now, I saw one source online saying Utah was 50% uptake on the vaccination. I couldn't confirm that. It was very hard to find any breakdown of records by state or anything. So I'm dismissing that, but I think it's plausible to assume that because members of the church were being pushed by their prophet to go get this vaccine, that rates would be higher than average. Interestingly, there were only 2 congressmen that voted against the national mandatory vaccination program for swine flu. One of them, a physician by the name of Ron Paul, early on in his congressional career. Okay, so before they canceled the big vaccine campaign, everyone's still in hysteria. The rollout of the vaccine is in full force. In September of that year, the First Presidency issues a letter in which they say the following: church members are encouraged to carefully consider the potential benefits and risks of this vaccination to the health of themselves and their families. Special consideration should be given to the protection of those who are ill or convalescent. We encourage church members to seek competent medical advice with questions they may have. Because of the comprehensive nature of this immunization campaign and the great cost associated with it, volunteers are being sought in local areas to assist in carrying out the vaccination. Members of the church who are technically qualified and who feel so inclined are encouraged to provide what community service they can to assist with this influenza immunization campaign, this forced, mandatory vaccination campaign, mind you. This is another quibble I have with this whole topic is everywhere that, CDC and all the scientists and politicians, they call it immunization, but so does the church. They buy into this term immunization, which I don't think every vaccine actually gives you immunity. And so, especially with having to get constant boosters and so forth. So it's this very, very like not praiseworthy, but flattering term to call these things immunizations. When they don't actually, always confer immunity for the virus in question. So that's 1976, swine flu, massive overreaction, forced campaign, and the First Presidency is saying that members should carefully consider the benefits and risks. This is far better than urging them to go get it or submitting to the forced, mandatory program or so forth. They're saying carefully consider the benefits and risks, seek competent medical advice, and then volunteer with the massive campaign. And then we go 2 years forward to 1978. Specifically in the month of May, the First Presidency says the following. Reports that increasing numbers of children are not being immunized against preventable childhood diseases deeply concern us. In the United States alone, approximately 20 million children, 40% of those 14 years or old or younger, have not been adequately immunized against polio, measles, German measles or rubella, diphtheria, pertussis or whooping cough, mumps, and tetanus. Every parent who is agonized when these diseases have maimed or brought premature death to their children would join us, we are certain, in a plea to mobilize against these deadly enemies. Immunization is such a simple yet vital matter, and such a small price to pay for protection against these destroying diseases. We urge members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to protect their own children through immunization. Then they may wish to join other public-spirited citizens in efforts to eradicate ignorance and apathy that have caused the disturbingly low levels of childhood immunization. Failure to act could subject untold thousands to preventable lifelong physical or mental impairment, including paralysis, blindness, deafness, heart damage, and mental retardation. Immunization campaigns in the United States and other nations, if successful, will end much needless suffering and erase the potential threat of epidemics. Such efforts are deserving of our full support. That is the 1978 statement that is cited in modern references, including that church press release in 2021, as saying that's when the First Presidency really leaned in a general way. This wasn't a polio-specific thing or a smallpox-specific thing or swine flu, as the other examples I cited were. This was a general statement on vaccines across many different diseases, and that becomes the basis upon which we start to get a lot of references in recent years, all pointing back to 1978. It wasn't the last time that members of the church were getting exposed to these ideas, of course. For example, in the 1985 Ensign magazine, they had this section called Random Sampler. And so after the messages from church leaders and so forth, it was this random sampler, some other little messages or a game or whatever, like just random stuff. And in there was an unsigned article, not written under the name of any one person, that says the following. Not too long ago, small children were the victims of childhood diseases, the very names of which struck fear into the hearts of parents. Polio, whooping cough, diphtheria, and others maimed or killed thousands of children. Today, with the use of immunizations, these diseases are becoming more and more uncommon. In fact, they're so uncommon that many parents have become lax about immunizing their children. Some feel that there is no need. Others fear adverse side effects. But parents have an obligation to protect their families through immunization. And then it says, the accompanying immunization schedule can help you ensure that your child is adequately immunized. This was actually like a pamphlet that the Relief Society put out. Take a look at this graphic. You can see it. Of course, this is 1985, similar to that first graphic I showed, when children were getting hardly any vaccines at the time, at least by comparison to what we now have in 2025 and beyond. And so this very modest and delayed, mind you, right? 2 months, you're getting a couple, 4 months, you're getting a couple, 6 months, you're getting one. And then it's like a whole I don't know, 3/4 of a year before you get another. Still minimal number overall and spaced out. But what I find very interesting about that message is they say, oh, many parents are getting lazy. Some of them are scared of adverse side effects. And then to completely dismiss that fear, which is a valid fear. Mind you, this is just a few years after the swine flu vaccine and all the Julian Barr cases and everything. So it's like, it's a valid concern that parents have for the overall health and well-being of their child, to weigh the risks and determine, what's appropriate. So they say, oh, others fear adverse side effects, and completely dismissing that concern, they then say parents have an obligation to protect their families through immunization. No asterisk, no qualifier, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Hey, parents, get over your ignorance, get over your fear. These are irrelevant. These are wrong. You have an obligation to protect your families through immunization. Pretty bold, right? A few years ago, this bubbled up on social media. This was in the June 2021 Friend during the height of the COVID vaccine. And here you had this little coloring page showing a child under the heading, I can be brave. And he's, getting a vaccine in his arm. He's masked. The doctor's masked. And it's, oh, I can get a vaccine and be brave. Like, why is this in a church magazine? The masks, the vaccine, like it's just total propaganda. And the caption that came up for this, because if you're looking at the image, there's the orange box at the bottom that doesn't have any, words in it. So I came up with a caption, and it reads, "Good global citizen receives literal godsend in his arm while showing love to others by wearing a mask. Not seen, out of frame. Klaus Schwab, smiling in approval." So, sorry, snarky, I know, but that, I just rolled my eyes. I was like, really? It's like with the few months ago, the polygamy stuff came out in one of the children's manuals, and we're like pushing this on little kids and everything. Like this coloring image of just buying into Babylonian crap and fear and, oh, but you can be brave to get this rush, anyways, I could go on. But point is, there have been lots of little things across the timeline of statements and content from the church indicating the church's support. Now, in many of these statements, of course, we're counseled, encouraged to seek out competent medical advice. One issue here is that I've shared before in past musings about leadership roulette, right? You get a bishop or stake president who's a hardliner versus a softie, and the fate of your membership and standing in the church is subject to these kind of these I don't know, changes in people, personalities and everything. And I think the same is true with doctors. Not all doctors have the same views. Most haven't done, I think, any significant research in depth on these vaccines, the newer ones especially, beyond what they're, hearing from the CDC and getting the little marketing brochure from the manufacturer, and they go to some conference and someone talks about it for 20 minutes. Like, I don't think that they're really doing their own in-depth research. And what was interesting is I came across this 2021 survey. So this is the height of COVID. They're pushing the vaccines. They're Operation Warp Speed. They're rolling these things out. And they do this survey of a ton of physicians in the United States. And they found that 10.1% of primary care physicians do not agree that, in general, vaccines are safe. 10%, 1/10 of physicians, according to this statistically appropriate pool of candidates that we can extrapolate across all of, physicians in the United States, 1/10 of them don't believe that vaccines are safe in general. That's really interesting. 9.3% do not agree that they're effective. 8.3% do not agree that they're important. It's fascinating. Roughly 1/10 of physicians. Now, where I found this survey, they're like attacking and dismissing these renegade physicians as, anti-vaxxers, as vaccine hesitant. They're trying to talk amongst themselves, this 90% majority. How do we combat this vaccine hesitancy, right? But when we're counseled to seek competent medical advice, usually it's the majority that's heavily propagandized, especially in a system like Big Pharma, with the financial incentives all in place to buy their silence, their cooperation, and train them up in that way through school and everything else. And so when the majority is trying to quell dissent, crush the minority, that's when I think a flag should go up and say, maybe we ought to pay attention to the minority. That doesn't inherently mean they're true. They're not true because they're inaccurate because they're in the minority, but it raises this question of like, hang on, like why is this happening? And maybe we ought to hear out these minority physicians. And doctors, I mean, they push crap like the flu vaccine. Here's a statement from some doctor that the American Medical Association, which is no friend of freedom, they put out on the flu vaccine that says there are benefits to us as individuals. We're less likely to get the flu. Even if we do develop the flu, we're less likely to need to be hospitalized, and it tends to be less severe if you get the vaccine. It is also about protecting others, your family, friends, community members. The flu vaccine is most effective for all of us when more of us get it, so we can get closer to achieving, at least for flu season, that herd immunity. Getting the flu shot is not just doing something for yourself, but it definitely is a way you can contribute to good health in your community, which is utter crap. Because every year when they're developing the flu vaccine, they literally guess at which strain will be dominant the following year. This is not like, oh, let's, because they have to ramp up and get all these flu vaccines done and out on the market in preparation for the season. They can't wait for figuring out which is the dominant strain and then go into the lab and produce everything and come out with a vaccine, because by that point, flu season is over. This stuff ebbs and flows, right? And so they try and guess at the dominant strain, and they flood the market with these flu vaccines, which I think are just utter ridiculousness in most cases. And here you have these doctors using the same line we heard during COVID and everything else, right? It's reducing your own symptoms. It's slowing and stopping the spread. It's herd immunity. It's about protecting others. It's the same kind of garbage. So to say that we should seek out competent medical advice, right? That is a big asterisk, a big qualifier. It's not medical advice from the propagandized physicians and the members of the medical association and the people who are in lockstep. If anything, when it comes to my health, I want to seek out kind of the rebels, the RFKs of the world. It doesn't mean I agree with them on anything, doesn't mean they're right on every issue, but the countercultural, the anti-establishment type of stuff, like I have some sympathies for as a default position, people who are trying to speak truth to power and find things that maybe are not simpatico with big pharma because, it's free or cheap, like ivermectin, for example, during COVID, because we had undercut this, this massive product in which they had invested all of this money. Okay, COVID, we're not going to spend much time here. You all know the statement from the First Presidency saying, we know that protection from the diseases they cause can only be achieved by immunizing a very high percentage of the population. I've always had concerns with that statement. They don't say can be achieved through prayer and priesthood and other health, remedies or anything else. Protection from these diseases can only be achieved by immunizing a very high percentage of the population. That to me is deeply concerning. They then also said that available vaccines, mind you, at the time, late 2021, have proven to be both safe and effective. That's not true, as I said on, in a recent musing. And then we can win this war if everyone will follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations of medical experts and government leaders. It doesn't say competent like it did in past ones. It doesn't encourage people to consider any kind of softer language. I've shared before a year or two ago that I had an occasion to go to the church headquarters right after this statement came out with a few associates and friends, I'll call them, and deliver a message expressing some concerns about the nature of that statement, the lack of the kind of agency-based, hey, seek this out prayerfully, talk to your physician, consider, weigh the risks, think about it. That past statements did have language like that. This was a much harder urging of obtaining the vaccine. And our recommendation was that another statement be issued that would kind of walk it back and allow for that softer language for people to not end up in like this faith crisis because they feel like their prophet is telling them to get this rushed big pharma product that they have concerns with, and putting people in this religious bind because their worldview is such that they thought, oh, the prophet is telling me this, but my conscience is telling me this, or my doctor is telling me something else. And ultimately our recommendations were not listened to or acted on in any way because that statement was not amended and it still stands. And I find it rather frustrating, especially in comparison to past statements that did have that softer language. Now, the church itself is very pro-vaccine, even from just a financial standpoint. The church has donated many millions of years over the years. For example, 2023, supporting $3 million for a malaria vaccine campaign in Africa. The same year, supporting UNICEF's efforts to train vaccinators in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as in Peru, working on polio and measles. The year prior, $10 million to fight polio and tetanus in Africa. The year before that, $20 million to provide 2 billion people COVID-19 vaccines in low and middle income countries. They're part of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. They've given a bunch of money over the years. In 2012, the humanitarian services arm of the church officially added vaccines to their initiatives, which joined clean water, emergency response, food production, neonatal resuscitation training, vision care, and wheelchairs. So it was in 2012 when the church, through its humanitarian arm, started to lean into this issue. They kicked it off with a $3 million donation. And since then, they've donated at least, from records that I've been able to find, $40 million plus, which, relative to their overall budget, let alone their humanitarian budget, is very minimal. But they have invested quite a bit of money. I've seen people complain, oh, the church is invested in Pfizer and they have all these stocks. Well, I probably do too, because I invest in the S&P and I invest in the mutual funds, and I'm just this little fish in a very big ocean, but I probably have fractional ownership of some shares in these companies that I don't even, know about. So I think any diversified stock portfolio is going to have some amount of pharmaceutical stocks. I don't really see this as an issue to get in a pinch over. Now, there's another issue that a lot of members get in a pinch over, get worried about, and that is the fetal cell issue, that some vaccines are developed from cell lines of aborted fetal tissue. The rubella and the MMR vaccine, rabies, hepatitis A, chickenpox, one of the COVID vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson one, was doing this. So what is this all about? Well, back in the 60s, there were two abortions in which the mother consented to physicians extracting some of the fetal cells, or the cells from this fetus. Later in 1985, there was another case. So there's three total, couple from the early 60s. And what was happening here is that researchers developing vaccines, of course, they know that viruses reproduce in cells, and it's better to do it in human cells than animal cells for a vaccine intended for humans. And so to grow viruses for a vaccine, one of the necessary tools that's needed is a type of cell in which the virus can incubate. But why a fetal cell versus just, taking some of my skin cells or swabbing my cheek or whatever? Well, the ideal aspect here for these researchers is that the fetal cells are isolated in a sterile environment in the womb, right? They're not infected with other viruses. It's just basically like fresh and pure type of cells having come from the womb. And now there are many people I am aware of who object to vaccines that originate from these fetal cell lines. And there are many vaccines, not all. This isn't a condemnation of all vaccines. There's only a handful of vaccines in which they were developed in this way. And, I think that argument probably, while I understand it, I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong because, yes, abortion is wrong and I detest it. And yes, it's tragic that it originated this way, that these cell lines, but what has really happened here, what happened is that they take these cells, but then the cells replicate. So what the labs are using now is like this, 33rd generation of cells after constant division, and then they freeze them and then they reuse them. And those fetal cells could just have easily been taken from a stillborn, baby or whatever. It didn't necessarily have to be an aborted baby. But and what I don't know, I'm speaking off the cuff here without looking this up. Like, could they have taken it from a live newborn baby? Probably not. But they could have taken it from like a stillborn, like a miscarriage or something like that. So it's tragic that it happened that way. But fast forward decades later, and what scientists are using in the labs right now are not those actual original cells. They're using kind of downstream cell division versions of it. And so I think the initial thing is tragic. I wish it would have been a different case or a different circumstance. But I don't know. Like, I have other concerns with vaccines that I've elaborated on. But I don't know that this in itself becomes a reason to object to the vaccines in general. And to state why, and then I'll give a few examples, I found this quote in a Catholic essay, or an essay from a Catholic scholar discussing the ethics of vaccines originating in abortion, because it's a concern for a lot of Catholics too, even though with COVID, I remember the Pope was dismissive of it, being like, no, it's fine, right? And a lot of Catholics are freaking out, like, what? We're against abortion, and why are you saying it's fine? And then Sharon Eubank on a multi-interfaith panel Zoom call was praising the Pope for overcoming the issue and pushing the vaccine and using his religious authority to promote it. So it's an issue for Catholics, faithful Catholics who are deeply anti-abortion. And here's this quote: "Acts of wrongdoing in the past regularly redound to the benefit of descendants who had no hand in the original crimes. It would be a high standard indeed if we were to require all benefits that we receive in the present to be completely free of every immorality of the past." I thought that was a great quote, and I think it's on point. Yes, we can object to, and I do object to the originating way in which these cells were obtained. But now we're dealing with multiple generations later, both in terms of years, but also the generations of the cells themselves. And we could force scientists to go procure the cells from a stillborn or a miscarriage or something, but like it doesn't substantively lead to any change in the science or the process or anything like that. There's a handful of examples I thought of that I think relate. The internet itself, its original version, ARPANET, was the product of the Cold War, this worshiping of gods of stone and steel, and the military trying to create a robust communications network. No one thinks that the internet is a tainted child of war. Even the most anti-war of people never even consider this point, right? That the internet in a way is the fruit of this rotten tree back from the days of communism and the Cold War. NASA is unconstitutional, forcing taxpayers to go on all these space adventures over the years, and yet we all benefit from satellites. Now, granted, we've got private parties like SpaceX now doing it, which is fantastic. But in decades past, right, we're all using satellite technology for various things and church transmissions and all that kind of stuff. And no one's talking about the unconstitutionality and problematic nature of taxpayer funding of NASA. World War II, Nazi physicians conducted all kinds of inhumane medical experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. And there's lots of research that came from that on hypothermia, high altitude physiology that have informed modern medical practices. Science, human health has benefited from the tragic way in which this research was developed. Does that mean we need to forget it somehow and replicate it in some other way that arrives at the same results and therefore is superfluous? After World War II, if you've read The Tuttle Twins Guide to True Conspiracies, which is one of my favorite books that we did, we talk in there about Operation Paperclip. This was a secret project or program in which the United States government recruited Nazi scientists and to come and work on military and aerospace projects in the United States in exchange for their freedom. So we have scientists like Wernher von Braun, who played a huge role in developing the American space program, including the return of the Saturn V rocket that enabled the Apollo moon landings. So you've got, again, the benefits coming from this original tainted, horrible, thing. We're on land that was taken by conquest at one point. Everybody is, right? Should we self-flagellate like all the woke people do, the land acknowledgments and the apologies of the spoiled provenance of my property, that it was taken and that I should somehow pay reparations, that I should feel bad for the half acre I live on because it was taken from whatever tribe long ago? Even the Federal Reserve debasing the dollar is a horrible thing, gave rise to Bitcoin, which I think has so many transformative properties for preserving wealth and intergenerational wealth, strengthening families, strengthening society, restraining government abuse and power. And there's lots of benefits that can come from this technology. And it is a direct fruit of this horrible, rotten thing known as the Federal Reserve. So let's wrap this up. My point there is that I think the fetal cell issue isn't really an issue. I have concerns with the origination of it, but I do with many other things in which information and technology and different things have evolved as a result of these spoiled things. I'll read that statement very briefly again, that from this Catholic guy: acts of wrongdoing in the past regularly redound to the benefit of descendants who had no hand in the original crimes. It would be a high standard indeed if we were to require all benefits that we receive in the present to be completely free of every immorality of the past. I think that is very well put. Okay, so speaking in general, to conclude here with a couple final observations, I think vaccines in general are okay. They're not against the gospel. I think God wants us to learn, even kind of command the elements in some ways. I think it's okay to develop nutritious strains of fruit and vegetables, or create better fertilizers, or take vitamin D supplements, and in general, dental technology. Like, I think it's okay to have technological and scientific advancement that allow us to improve lives, improve health. We're not Christian scientists, right? These are guys that believe in prayer for healing. They reject conventional medical treatments. And yes, I think we ought to have more emphasis from a health perspective on prayer, and priesthood blessings and godly power. I think it's to our detriment that we don't focus more on that. But I think God also wants us to put in the work. I think science is not anti-God. I think the miracles that we often think about God they're following scientific principles, just at a higher, level that we don't yet understand, right? And so I don't think scientific research and developing these things is in any way in conflict with our faith. Now, granted, we shouldn't put our trust in the arm of flesh and big pharma and CDC. Like, we have to study these things out. We have to be very cautious. We do have to consult our consciences and pray about them and speak to competent medical professionals and everything else. I find this interesting by contrast from Joseph Smith. Here's this quote. He says, "I preached to a large congregation at the stand on the science and practice of medicine, desiring to persuade the saints to trust in God when sick, and not in an arm of flesh, and live by faith, and not by medicine or poison. And when they were sick and had called for the elders to pray for them, and they were not healed, to use herbs and mild food." That's kind of interesting. We've come a long way, I think, away from that. Again, I think it's more helpful to better embrace faith and prayer and priesthood and so forth. Here's, for example, Doctrine and Covenants 42. "Whosoever among you are sick and have not faith to be healed, but believe, shall be nourished with all tenderness with herbs and mild food, and that not by the hand of an enemy." We've got Alma 46. "And there were some who died with fevers, which at some seasons of the year were very frequent in the land, but not so much so with fevers, because of the excellent qualities of the many plants and roots which God had prepared to remove the cause of diseases, to which men were subject by the nature of the climate." And of course, we have the Word of Wisdom itself, section 89, where we read, "All wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man, every herb in the season thereof," and so on and so forth. So you got Joseph and others saying prayer, priesthood, blessings, mild food, herbs, to not rely on the arm of flesh. And now what we hear is very fleshy counsels urging us to go get the thing. No counsel to pursue herbs, mild food, prayer, priesthood blessings, and so forth. Kind of interesting. I think the science behind vaccine development is very sound, right? The body gets some type of negative reaction. The body adapts to overcome it. The problems are the trust of everyone involved along the way, right? Like, the tiny number of government-backed companies that are doing it, the corrupt nature of the CDC overseeing the process, the scientific community that's been completely bought and sold and corrupt to its core, including the medical associations and all these guys, the fear-mongering, the incestuous relationship with the media, right? There's a lot of trust issues as it pertains to the science, to the point where you have the Faucis of the world saying, "I represent science, and if you're, attacking me, you're attacking science," which is absolutely ridiculous. And the final point I'll make is this. The church's position on COVID, and when I say the church's position, I'm obviously talking about the First Presidency specifically. I think their position on COVID was worse than on the swine flu. Again, think of the message in 1976 regarding the swine flu and the mass hysteria that elicited. They said, and I quote, "to carefully consider the potential benefits and risks of this vaccination. And then we encourage," they said, "church members to seek competent medical advice. Carefully consider benefits and risks. Seek competent medical advice." By contrast with COVID, it was protection can only be achieved through these vaccines. We urge individuals to get vaccinated, not consider. We urge you to do so. They've proven to be safe and effective. Follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations of medical experts, not competent medical experts, just their recommendations, which we're stamping with the approval of wise and thoughtful. You need to follow the medical experts who, in lockstep, have nearly all said that these vaccines are safe and effective when that simply is not true. So the church in general, like, look, polio and malaria and all these things, like, I don't think vaccines are inherently problematic. And there are many vaccines that have done a fantastic job at nearly or entirely eliminating some of these diseases, which historically caused a lot of suffering and death. I think that's a good thing. I don't think we should have the position of being against all vaccines. I think we should be against rushed vaccines where the financial incentives are such to suppress contrary evidence, to not have longitudinal studies, to attack physicians who have concerns, who want to see more results, and so on and so forth. That should send up a warning signal that we ought to be very cautious. I do think we ought to substantially delay vaccines that we give to these young infants. I don't think God made human bodies wrong that suddenly require all these, synthetic supports to be able to be more healthy. I do think the flu vaccine is ridiculous, and the COVID one along with it. So I don't think that the church should take the position just in general about vaccination/immunization that it's all a good thing. I mean, the swine flu vaccine is lumped in there, and if they're making these general positions as they did in 1978, when 2 years prior they were encouraging people at least to consider the swine flu vaccine, which ended up killing way more people than were killed by the actual virus itself, right? That should, I think, suggest that we need more nuance here, that some vaccines have clearly proven to be high reward and near zero risk. Others might have more questions about it. And for that reason, someone might justifiably want to wait it out, wait and see, wait for more evidence, right? Get more studies. Let's see what this looks like. Are there any type of side effects or issues with people on other medications or other it's totally fine to gather more information and be more cautious and concerned about this. And yet some of the church's messaging has lost some of that kind of agency acknowledging, deferential, study it out in your mind, consider the benefits and the risks. And I think it would be good for us to return to that. So, hot topic. I know it could be very divisive for some people. Be curious to hear in the comments if you are aware of anything else that I missed where the church has involved itself in vaccines, either through funding and finances or statements that have been made. Clearly, as a default, church the leaders do support it. They do, as they said, limit missionary travel based on whether you're vaccinated or not. And so they do kind of have a deep concern, wanting to see, going back for decades, this isn't a new thing, wanting to see at least, the missionaries before they're sent out internationally to be fully vaccinated. I'm sure some of you have stories. I'd love to hear them in the comments. We'll see you there, and then I'll see you next Sunday.